One of the things that really stood out to me over the last 12 months, and it was an accelerate, everyone talks about this acceleration of certain trends around post-COVID. So, digitalization, homework, and all of those things, which, very topical and undoubtedly true. One of the things that really struck me was market share gains across all industries for leading businesses. And that was um, there was almost without parallel. And I think for the strategy as we look at last year, we do tend to own the one commonality about all the businesses that we invest in, irrespective of where they're located in the industry that they're in, is that they do tend to be the best player, the leading player, or in the top three players in that respective industry. So we own good, high quality companies that they've got an opportunity to replicate. And they took huge amounts of market share last year. And that was the thing that really stood out to me. I mean, I was slightly sort of surprised that even soy sauce manufacturing in China, we own a company called Foshan Haitian. We've owned it for a number of years. It's got an excellent management team that they manufacture high quality soy sauce across a range of different price points, sell into restaurants, sell into the consumer channel. And what COVID actually did is that despite the pressure that came on the restaurant channel as a consequence of closures, it made consumers far more aware of product provenance and brand quality. So the actual ingredients and the sourcing and the heritage of soy sauce as a product became ever more important, even more important than it had been previously. And what had been in China, regional, ultimately, for the most part, regional players, so strong regional shares for individual companies, and then Foshan and one or two others being a nationwide player, you saw significant concentration of market share gains. And so that was a business which grew its top line at 20% per annum as a consequence of driving channel shifts into consumer product segmentation, price points, etc., despite the headwinds in the restaurant channel. And we saw that play out in other ways. I mean, consumer channel in India for domestic consumer companies, so health and personal care companies. It's a very large market, very underpenetrated market, lots of informal sellers of products. So you need multi-layered distribution. Online, relatively small as a percentage of kind of total overall retail sales. But we saw formal retail take significant market share. And that was as a consequence of I think, the consumer being far more aware of where product comes from. So trust in brand names becoming more important, but also the ways in which, the consumer shopped across all end markets changing. And so that was one of the kind of key features. And I think when we look at markets which re-rated very aggressively in certain instances, particularly in North Asia, some of those countries that we're talking about, and maybe we'll get onto that later on in the discussion. I think a lot of it was, as a consequence of monetary policy and markets going up generally, but also the leaders re-rating further because of these market share gains. And I don't see that going away. And actually, when we look at the opportunity set within the investment universe, I do believe that there are more opportunities, particularly in countries like India, where we've always been waiting for this kind of formal retail, modern retail formats to take share. I think that maybe we're on the point of a sort of somewhat tipping point here where that starts to get accelerated. And that creates, a lot of opportunities for some of the businesses that we follow. I mean, not all that we own, but lots that we follow. So it's an exciting time from that point of view. And so, you look at Zhongsheng, which I mentioned earlier on in terms of the auto demand cycle. Clearly, its home base is Shanghai. That's where majority of the wealth is. That's where the disposable incomes are. These businesses now make that shift out towards other provinces, other areas, and capture that market growth. So I don't think it leads to kind of an immediate sort of tailing off of the opportunity from a market growth perspective. It just moves it and shifts it, and companies need to be aware of how they manage that challenge. I think what you will see, and this is different to India, what you will see is that, market growth is a function of volumes, so penetration of units, and a function of price. Now, price we think of as price rises, but really it's premiumization, right? It's taking In the case of home appliances, it's taking a very basic rice cooker or oven hob and turning it into a smart cooker or a smart hob or a smart refrigerator, right? So those sorts of shifts are ongoing. And I think increasingly, for some of the key players we've invested in, that technological advancement in terms of the products that they manufacture will be important in preserving their relevance and market share within the end market, but also driving growth of the marketplace going forward. So it'll become a shift of less volume, less consumption of units per capita, but the units that are being consumed are higher price point and ultimately probably more value add to the companies that can execute on that. And so it's a slight shift in business model, and it requires R&D investment. It requires manufacturing and technological prowess to execute on it, rather than just mass market, basic quality product, which we would have seen over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. So I think that would be the sort of most important shift to be cognizant of. You see it across the piece, and I think it's just a natural consequence of once basic needs are covered, then individuals will think about other areas. So education is a massive one, right? We've seen huge spend in tutoring, online education services, and that's across all markets. Brazil in particular has seen significant growth of education spend and healthcare because the public sector has been so woefully underfunded. So you see those elements of spend because it's seen as a necessity, but also that plays out across all markets. That once you get to a certain level of income and wealth, your disposable income grows, and you want better quality product, whether that comes through autos, home sales, education, health, technology, all manner of other areas. We obviously see this trend of rising middle class in China, and it's been going on for some time. As in the same way that we said that not all emerging market countries are equal, not all provinces in China are equal, right? I mean, it is a vast market. You've got well over 1.5 billion people, and the difference between Shanghai and sort of the Western Seaboard versus Eastern Seaboard versus the Western provinces is vastly different. So I think that we have to be cognizant of that when we're looking at the opportunity set. And yes, a number of the largest sort of businesses, particularly domestic-facing consumer businesses, would have grown significant market shares and revenue streams from those eastern kind of countries. We are seeing opportunities elsewhere in emerging markets away from China, but even within China, there's still fantastic opportunities. Like home improvements is an industry we followed for 4 or 5 years. We're not invested in companies there at this particular point, but we've done a lot of work on the area, and the vast majority of wardrobes and cupboards and kitchens are still installed by individual carpenters, right, as opposed to being standardized through professional companies, and that's a huge market opportunity for those players. And so these are not the kind of businesses that are at the forefront of everyone's mind when they think of China. They're not the kind of big Chinese tech companies or the big Chinese banks or so forth, but they are businesses that are executing on an opportunity set, and they can create significant value. So for us as a business, with our research infrastructure and our local knowledge of the companies and the markets that we invest in, it's very important to keep identifying these newer areas to ensure that we're able to continue to deliver consistent cross-cycle returns without sort of being too singularly focused on large parts of the market, which maybe become more penetrated, as you alluded to. Again, brand, provenance, trust in after-sales service and so forth, all of these factors become more important over time, and yeah, it creates opportunities. And the other thing is that space is a big constraint for personal living space. Personal living space is a big constraint, and so these companies do have the ability to effectively utilize that, and that adds value to the consumer. So that's one of the trends. And China as well has been through a very strong new home sales trend over the last 20 years. Increasingly, you're seeing more secondary transactions in home sales, and that leads with it refurbishment, right? Which is not actually a huge part of total property spend at this point of time. So, whereas you look at most markets, I live in the UK, but refurbishment is over half the market versus new build. And so I think that those dynamics, these shifts as economies develop, are important to keep in mind.